I own a letter from my great-grandma, Minnie Cunard, that's written inside a birthday card. It's a note to my father on turning 30. It's not terribly long. In addition to wishing my dad a very happy birthday, Minnie mentions the new house my parents had recently bought and the flu that she'd managed to sidestep that winter. Then, revealing her sense of humor, she adds, "And since my doctor will be out of town for a month, I'll try to stay well." At the end of the letter, my great-grandma mentions me. She says, "Tell Jennifer hello. I don't suppose she remembers me." I was 7 years old at the time, and I definitely remembered Minnie Cunard. Whenever I saw her, I was awestruck by her white hair and her many, many wrinkles, testaments to how long she'd lived on the planet. Also memorable was the fact that when we would drive down to visit her in Missouri, my younger sister and I got to ramble about outside and do as we pleased as the adults had their visit. In many ways, key aspects of my great-grandmother are contained within this short letter. When I hold it in my hands, I see the careful script of a woman who didn't read or write very much, and who took her time when she penned a letter. The cursive is tidy and antiquated with embellished capital letters. It makes Minnie's writing look softer and more feminine. The note's brevity hints at Minnie's lack of a formal education, and yet the letter itself attests to her staunch belief that writing to my dad for his birthday was an important social ritual. The fact that Minnie touches on the importance of good health and the great satisfaction she assumes my parents feel in owning their first home, all the while effacing herself, apologizing for the card's lack of prettiness, and then supposing that her great-granddaughter won't remember her, speaks to Minnie's generational, regional, and gendered mindsets. For she was a Midwesterner, a child of the Depression, and of course, a woman. When I have the letter in front of me, these words and handwriting vividly restore my great-grandmother to my mind's eye. I see her once again, tall and lean, with a scent of wool, rose water, and ivory soap. I believe that letters have this magical ability to resurrect their writers in a way that other kinds of prose do not. And yes, I do mean magical ability. The epistolary form is almost holy writ. These are documents that contain death and life, the self and the reader, as well as the past and the eternal present tense. Unlike other forms of communication, letters live. They have their own tiny heartbeats, even long after the letter writer might be dead or gone. Now that said, not all letters contain such magic. I'm not referring to typed holiday updates with inserted family photos, even if they've been sent through the mail. And I don't mean emails either, even if a message has a salutation and a signature and is longer than 300 words. By letter, I mean a bona fide epistle, or what the Oxford English Dictionary defines as a written text on paper or parchment addressed to a person, an organization, or other body, especially one sent by post or messenger. So let's agree that a letter is a kind of communication between a sender and a receiver, written in longhand on a piece of paper, or parchment, I suppose, if you have any. Now, with this definition in mind, to understand better what I mean when I say these kinds of letters live, let's try this exercise. Write a letter to someone with whom you have a long-standing relationship. The recipient might be a parent, a sibling, a lover, a child, a partner, or a colleague. In this letter, talk about a pivot point in your life, some life-changing event that's joyous or shameful, that's difficult or powerful. And then explain how this life-changing event, how it changed you. Maybe you've always wanted to share this episode with your recipient and to offer him or her thanks for having played a role in it. Maybe you want to convey a struggle you went through. Or maybe you want to consider the moment from the perspective of one who is looking back on it many years later. Whatever your motivation, take the letter seriously and make sure that you write it out in longhand on an actual piece of paper. Then put it in an envelope, address it, stamp it, and send it through the mail. In the 2 or 3 days required for the letter to arrive at your recipient's doorstep, contact the same person through 2 additional mediums. First, write an email. Then second, send this person a text message, or if that's not possible, write on his or her Facebook wall, or get in touch through some other form of social media. In the email, the text message, or the Facebook post, you don't have to refer to that life-changing event you wrote about in your letter. Just make sure to reach out through these other media before your snail mail letter arrives. Now, after your correspondent receives your letter and has had a chance to digest it, get back in touch with him or her in whatever way you wish. And ask, what difference did it make to receive a handwritten letter as opposed to a text, an email, or a Facebook post? What is it about the hard copy letter that makes it distinct from other forms of written communication? I'm confident you'll find that the person on the other end of the letter will talk about how special it felt to get something in your own hand. The recipient will probably mention the tactility of this communication, or maybe how it can be saved in a way that email and text messages and Facebook posts cannot, due to their ephemeral nature. Your letter will feel particularly intimate to your correspondent, even more than the buzz of a text message in a pocket. And this intimacy comes not only from the loop or scrawl of your handwriting, but also because of the time you spent to write it. The slowness of exchanging letters and writing them, reading them, and responding to them encourages deeper and more extended conversations. And that's true even though you weren't there when your letter reached its destination. Though absent in body, it will feel to your recipient as though you were present in the room, in a way that electronic communication never quite replicates. So this exercise underscores the distinctive form that is letter writing. Letters are unlike any other means of communication, and it's this singularity that draws essay writers to them. For epistolary essays adopt the unique elements that define the genre of the letter: its intimacy, immediacy, and materiality. The epistolary essay is itself an ancient form as old as letter writing. Epistolary essays were developed by Greco-Roman rhetoricians such as Epicurus, Seneca the Younger, Cicero, to put forward philosophical and political ideas. In the Bible, the epistles of St. Paul trade on the familiarity of the genre to convey Christian theology. Letter writing also provided Paul with a means to maintain contact with far-flung churches, to keep people connected in their shared doctrine and religious practice. So epistolary essays originated in politics, philosophy, and theology. As a result, they push letters from the private sphere into the public one, even as they contain personal or confessional elements. Sometimes epistolary essays even start out as private letters, intended for a single recipient. Other times, such essays are offered up as open letters to readers beyond the immediate recipient. Some examples of open letters include Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1838 correspondence addressed to President Martin Van Buren, in which Emerson argued against the government's Cherokee removal order, or Virginia Woolf's 1938 extended essay entitled 3 Guineas, in which she responds to a gentleman who is asking for her help in trying to prevent war, or Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote to advocate for nonviolent resistance as the best means for combating American racism and segregation. Whether an epistolary essay is meant for a single recipient or is written with a general readership in mind, the writer gains an intimacy, one that's embedded in all letters. And that's what distinguishes an epistolary essay from other essay forms. There is something profound about the human contact embedded in letters. It's a trace of the writer's body that persists symbolically, even when a letter is typed and circulated widely. Handwriting signifies that human contact, in part due to the eccentric nature of longhand, like the stamp of a person's character. When we receive a letter, it's almost inevitable that we want to interpret the meaning behind the script. If the handwriting is illegible, the letter might appear to be the work of a genius or a madman. If it's looping, open cursive, maybe it's the hand of a lover. If the writer's script is slashing and fierce, we might believe that this denotes masculinity. But if the words are consistently well-formed with swirling T's and F's, this might come across as indicating a more feminine disposition. What I'm talking about is graphology, and the pseudoscientists who believe in graphology make the claim that a writer's psychological state is reflected in his handwriting. Despite overwhelming evidence that graphology is pretty useless in determining a person's work ethic or personality traits, the popular imagination is still taken with the idea that an author's script equals who he or she is. Many suspenseful movies link a killer's handwriting to his antisocial behavior, and many romantic comedies suggest that a boyfriend's true interest is revealed through his love script. In a poem called To the Reader, the Victorian poet Fanny Kern Weir wrote, "Whereby the writer by his pen doth show the inward self of those we outward know, describing to our vision clear and sure the heart that fails, or strength that will endure." In other words, part of the mystique of any letter is in the handwriting itself. So even when an epistolary essay is formed out of the cold, uniform pixels of Times New Roman font, the reader who sees the salutation "son," or "my dear sir," or "my dear Jane" conjures up the chocolate smears and red wine stains and doodles and crossed-out mistakes of the author. It's possible to imagine the writer's skin cells trailing behind the sentences like Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs. Within the words of a letter, then, is the letter writer herself, bent over the page, scribbling intently. By imagining this writing process, the wine she drank, the words or phrases she gave up on, the sketches she drew to emphasize an emotion or to make a joke, the letter invokes its author. Letters contain human desires, and they reveal human truths. And so the form of the letter reveals the writer's process of writing. This further humanizes and familiarizes the author, which is yet another credibility boost for an epistolary essayist. Combining intimacy and this peek behind the writer's curtain, an epistolary essay taps into a collective psychology, one that's captured and circulated through letters. Consider the national sensation of Frank Warren's Post-Secret project, which you might have heard of. Warren's project was so successful that it grew into multiple books, a website, a TED Talk, and a touring show, all of which featured the same simple act. Millions of anonymous people mailing postcards to Warren that reveal their greatest secrets. Or think about our human obsession with purloined, lost, and rediscovered letters, such as those that were left in nooks and crannies all over the home of a 6-year-old girl with brain cancer. She wanted her parents to find the letters after she died, as a way to connect with them, even from the grave. Of course, many people hold on to boxes of old letters from past lovers or dead family members. I certainly do. And Americans are willing to pour money into archives to house our national letters, such as those by our founding fathers and mothers, because we see them as a repository of our national history and culture. Letters articulate nations, and letters articulate selves. So an epistolary essayist might take for granted that her essay will convey a strong sense of reality and veracity. She might also take for granted the reader's hope to recognize himself within the essay as well, to be mirrored in the letter's intimate authenticity. And that is because while we tend to believe that letters convey the unvarnished truth of a relationship between two people, we also enjoy the thrill of voyeurism mixed with the wonder of recognition that letters provide. Across many centuries, there is a kind of undisguised nakedness to epistolary communications. From letters, we hear ordinary people speaking of their dreams, of their love affairs and heartbreaks, of their jealousy and avarice, of their struggles on the battlefield or in the kitchen or in Congress. We also hear of aspirations we have for ourselves and for our communities. The historians Lisa Grunwald and Stephen Adler explain in their anthology, Letters of the Century, that letters provide what history sounds like when it is still part of everyday life. So while we may feel voyeuristic overhearing the private confessions or secrets contained in letters, we also nod our heads, recalling our own struggles with loss, love, frustration, anger, and thwarted desire. Letters ring true, and what people write in them tends to be believed. The most important common denominator that makes epistolary essays letter-like is that they speak to a specific audience and thus retain their credibility as trustworthy and confidential. Epistolary essay writers play up the genre's privacy by addressing a particular person and thus revealing aspects of a relationship between two people that serves as representations of more universal themes and ideas. Ultimately, the epistolary essay aspires to convey something profound to the reader, something that elevates the letter beyond a private expression of love or loss, guilt or glee. Now let me be clear that my great-grandma Minnie's birthday letter to my dad is not an epistolary essay. So why not? Because it's not meant to be didactic. It's informational and sentimental. And while Minnie is heartfelt, she doesn't attempt to change my dad's mind about the nature of art or about governmental policy or about how to fight against depression. Her letter isn't trying to reach beyond my dad to address the beliefs of others either, not even those of her great-granddaughter. The epistolary essay, in contrast, becomes one of the most effective forms of the essay when a writer wants to be both private and public at once, to grapple with difficult subjects and also influence readers about how to think in new ways about these subjects. Between 1903 and 1908, the poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote 10 letters to a young man named Franz Kappes. Rilke was responding to Kappes's requests for critical commentary on his poems. Kappes also wanted advice on how to be a better artist. After Rilke's death, Kappes published this correspondence as Letters to a Young Poet. And although they weren't originally meant as essays, these letters constitute a series of thoughtful pieces on subjects, such as how to listen more closely to one's heart and how to be confident in one's poetic abilities. The 8th letter that Rilke wrote to Kappes arrived in the summer of 1904, and it begins like this. I want to talk to you again for a little while, dear Mr. Kappes, although there is almost nothing I can say that will help you, and I can hardly find one useful word. You have had many sadnesses, large ones, which passed, and you say that even this passing was difficult and upsetting for you. But please, ask yourself whether these large sadnesses haven't rather gone right through you. Perhaps many things inside you have been transformed. Perhaps somewhere, someplace, deep inside your being, you have undergone important changes while you were sad. The only sadnesses that are dangerous and unhealthy are the ones that we carry around in public in order to drown them out with the noise. Like diseases that are treated superficially, they just withdraw, and after a short interval, break out again, all the more terribly, and gather inside us and our life that is unlived, rejected, lost, life that we can die of. Perhaps we would bear our sadnesses with greater trust than we have in our joys, for they are the moments when something new has entered us, something unknown. Here, Rilke is talking about the nature of melancholy and of depression. He's thinking about how writers come to understand the workings of such sadness and also about its potential usefulness. He's not talking about any explicit problems in Mr. Kappas' life, a missing cat, a toothache, an eviction notice, a hated job, a spate of bad lover. Instead, Rilke's letter is thoughtful and probing, attempting to discern a greater reason for why humans experience sadness. Rilke also wants to think about what melancholy can potentially offer, particularly to a writer. He calls sadness a new experience that makes all other feelings grow mute and withdraw, which allows for important changes in a person's self-knowledge. Now, Rilke's letter is clearly intimate. He calls Mr. Kappas dear and makes reference to Kappas's many large sadnesses. But the use of the second-person you quickly feels universal rather than directed solely to young friends. Part of this universality results from Rilke's lack of specificity about Kappas's life. Instead of making a list of Kappas's trials and tribulations, he creates a texture of detail through metaphor. Of course, that is a favorite poet's trick. Rilke compares dangerous and unhealthy sadnesses to diseases that are treated superficially, only to come back all the more terribly. And this strategy of locating details in metaphor means that Rilke's advice to Kappas can become advice for any would-be poet. In a nutshell, this use of the second-person you is central to how and why Rilke's letters are epistolary essays. It's also key to understanding why these letters continue to serve as a kind of handbook for young poets more than a century after they were first sent and received. Okay, let's turn to one final example. I'm going to fast forward to a much more recent epistolary essay, this one by Ta-Nehisi Coates, a correspondent for The Atlantic magazine and the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. Coates' best-selling book, Between the World and Me, is about the impossibility of living within a black body and being treated as an equal member of society in the United States. It is presented to the reader as an extended letter from Coates to his adolescent son. Here's how it begins. Son, last Sunday the host of a popular news show asked me what it meant to lose my body. The host was broadcasting from Washington, D.C., and I was seated in a remote studio on the far west side of Manhattan. A satellite closed the miles between us, but no machinery could close the gap between her world and the world for which I had been summoned to speak. When the host asked me about my body, her face was replaced by a scroll of words written by me earlier that week. The host read these words for the audience, and when she finished, she turned to the subject of my body, although she did not mention it specifically. The host wished to know why I felt that America's progress, or rather the progress of those Americans who believe that they are white, was built on looting and violence. Hearing this, I felt an old and indistinct sadness well up in me. The answer to this question is the record of the believers themselves. The answer is American history. There is nothing extreme in this statement. When Abraham Lincoln declared in 1863 that the Battle of Gettysburg must ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, he was not merely being aspirational. At the onset of the Civil War, the United States of America had one of the highest rates of suffrage in the world. The question is not whether Lincoln truly meant government of the people, but what our country has, throughout its history, taken the political term people actually to mean. In 1863, it did not mean your mother or your grandmother, and it did not mean you or me. Thus, America's problem is not its betrayal of government of the people, but the means by which the people acquired their names. This leads us to another equally important ideal, one that Americans implicitly accept, but to which they make no conscious claim. Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined feature of the natural world. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the middle passage or the trail of tears the way one deplores an earthquake, a tornado, or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of humans. But race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy, so much as one of hierarchy. Like Rilke's epistolary essays that are addressed to Mr. Kappas, Coates is reaching out beyond his son to a larger audience. On the one hand, Coates talks exclusively to his child, as when he points out that President Lincoln's designation of people in the Gettysburg Address did not include your mother or your grandmother, and it did not mean you and me. On the other hand, though, Coates is talking to many other people as well. And what is both fascinating and powerful about his rhetorical strategy is that while sometimes he speaks to all Americans, sometimes he speaks only to white Americans. When Coates argues that race is the child of racism, not the father, his audience is universal. He's speaking to both blacks and whites. So what Coates is trying to teach here is meant for everyone. And when he qualifies his phrase, America's progress, with, or rather the progress of those Americans who believe that they are white, Coates is talking to those people whose whiteness is their race. In other words, he's talking to people like me. As Coates' epistolary essay evolves, this shift between speaking directly to his son and speaking to a multitude of citizens becomes even more strategic and pointed. There are moments when Coates' readers are excluded from the intense privacy of his parental relationship with his child. And sometimes some or all of his audience is invited in. In this way, Coates' choice to write an epistolary essay links form to function very powerfully. By revealing the intrinsic racism embedded in American history and culture, he makes white readers quite aware of their own race, as he either includes or excludes them from the content of his letter. In doing so, Coates underscores his main point, that American racism is a pervasive and long-standing problem, one with no easy or quick solution. Okay, so how might you apply the special characteristics of the letter to writing your own epistolary essays? Now don't worry, you don't have to be a lyric poet of the stature of Rilke or a cultural critic with the force and eloquence of Ta-Nehisi Coates. What you do need is someone to write to, as well as a topic to write about, and it should be neither purely informative nor simply frivolous. This means that you aren't going to write about the weather or your new job, and you're not going to write about all of the funny and fabulous TV series you binge-watched over the past year. Instead, your subject matter should be about a philosophic, political, or personal topic that matters to people beyond you and your recipient. So at the start of this lecture, I asked you to consider writing about a personal pivot point or life-changing event in a letter that you would send to a trusted recipient. As the basis of an epistolary essay, you could start here once more, but this time you could write about a personal struggle or issue that you've been working through more recently, such as how to communicate better with your teenage daughter, or how to manage dicey office politics with good humor and aplomb. Or you could write about a topic with national significance, immigration policies, the current state of the economy, school education standards, or the rise of social media in our popular culture. Whatever you choose, your aim should be twofold. First, to develop and define your topic, and second, to teach the recipient of your letter. That's the designated recipient, and also anyone else who will read it, something vital and true about your subject. Your purpose is didactic. You're writing this epistolary essay in order to educate as well as to communicate. Finally, you might try using the second-person pronoun you instead of just repeating your recipient's name. You'll continue to count on the intimacy that's created by addressing your essay to a single individual. But by referring to your larger audience as you, we achieve that double audience that all epistolary essayists are after. In other words, you'll simultaneously address the family member or friend you're hoping to convince, and any other reader by searching for the honest and heartfelt connections that letters imply. Finally, as you draft your epistolary essay, keep in mind what I said at the beginning of this lecture. Writing a letter is a magical experience. The contemporary writer Haruki Murakami expresses this in his epistolary novel, Norwegian Wood, stating, "How wonderful it is to be able to write someone a letter, to feel like conveying your thoughts to a person, to sit at your desk and to pick up a pen, to put your thoughts into words like this. It is truly marvelous."